Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us today. My name is Professor Heaven Crawley. I'm Director of the UKRI GCRF South-South Migration Inequality and Development Hub, which is something of a mouthful, so we're more commonly known by our shorter name, which is MIDEQ. And MIDEQ stands for Migration for Development and Equality, which really reflects the project aspirations, namely to generate knowledge and information about migration between the countries of the Global South, otherwise known as South-South migration, and to bring this knowledge to bear on both the processes of development and on what we see as the ruthless, relentless, and rising inequalities that exist between North and South, between rich and poor, between migrants and non-migrants, and of course between migrants themselves, for whom there are huge inequalities in the ability to travel safely and legally, and for they and their families to benefit from the opportunities that migration potentially brings. I'd really like to warmly welcome you all to this first MIDEQ public event, this first public webinar. Since the project was launched in Ghana in February 2019, we've been really busy setting up the research infrastructure for this project with our partners, 12 partners in the Global South, and designing the research which was due to start in March 2020, exactly the same time that the COVID-19 pandemic fundamentally changed the world in which we live, and indeed the nature of international migration itself. And since that time, many of those involved in MIDEQ have written about the impacts of COVID on migration and on migrants living in the Global South, and in particular on the ways in which COVID has deepened and amplified some of the existing inequalities with which migration has come to be associated. And you may have seen examples of that work running in the background as you arrived today. So I feel like in that context, it's really appropriate that COVID-19 is the subject of our first webinar today. And I'm really delighted that Professor Francis Nyamnjoh, who's a valued member of the MIDEQ Advisory Board, has kindly agreed to present his paper on the resilience of systematic suppression, oppression, and repression in this context. It's the one thing that more than anything else seems to survive despite everything that's thrown at it. Francis will be introduced by Professor Louis Hearns-Marcellin, who is Associated Dean for Program Development and Professor of Social Sciences at the University of Miami, and Chancellor of INURED, the Inter-University Institute for Research and Development, which is our project partner in Haiti. Hearns is also co-director of MIDEQ, and it's a real privilege to have him chair this event today. Before I hand over to Hearns, just a few housekeeping points. I mean, we would have these in an ordinary webinar, but we also, of course, need to have them in the context of a Zoom webinar. The presentation from Francis will last around 30 minutes, and you will hopefully have had access to the slides beforehand, and they'll also be circulated afterwards. There'll then be a conversation between Francis and Hearns about some of the issues raised in his paper, and an opportunity for you to ask questions or indeed to make your own comments and contributions. So we'd ask you, given that we've got quite a large group, to do that via the chat function, and Hearns and I will endeavour to gather those questions up at the end so that we can give them to Francis, and indeed you may have questions for Hearns himself. Please be aware that this event will be recorded, and we're doing that in order that we can share it with people subsequently. And please bear with us on the tech. Mostly these things go fine, sometimes they don't. We have variable internet connections in all of our contexts. If you have any problems or issues, just again, write them in the chat function and we'll try and put them right. But as I say, all of the papers will be circulated afterwards, so you can catch up in your own time as well if there are any problems. I'll come back towards the end of the event, and I'll conclude by telling you a little bit more about the next event series. But for now, I'll hand over to Hearns and to Francis, and I hope you have a very enjoyable webinar today. Thank you, Hearns.
Thank you, Heaven, for organizing this, and thank you, Francis, for accepting to be here with us and doing this wonderful presentation. And I'm going to rapidly introduce Professor Francis Nyamnjoh. We are good friends and we have been working for some times here. Professor Nyamnjoh holds, his studies at the University of Yaoundé in Cameroon. And he did his PhD at the University of Leicester in the UK. And later on, he has a wonderful trajectories that went from Codesria to University of Cape Town, where now he teaches anthropology and in the humanities. Professor Nyamnjoh has published a lot of books, a lot of articles. He is very well known in the circles of anthropologists and social scientists, and the commentaries about the social issues in the world. His most renowned book is At What Must Fall, Nibbling at Resilient Colonialism in South Africa. He is also a researcher. He is a B1 rotated researcher at the research by the South African National Research Foundation. He is also a fellow of the Cameroon Academy of Science since August 2011. He is also a fellow of the African Academy of Science since 2014 and a fellow of the Academy of Science of South Africa. So he has his publication goes, he has published from What Must Fall to Africa, Media, Democracy and the Politics of Belonging, Anthropology of Cannibalism, and so forth and so on. He has his publication, his legends, but I'm not going to take your attention too much on that because he has a lot to tell us today. Professor Nyamnjoh is also a storyteller. The way that he teaches, he brings a baggage of humility, a baggage of understanding what he calls incompleteness. That calls for you, in order for him to be full, to be complete, he needs you. In order for you to be complete, or each other to be complete, we need each other. So the COVID situation has created a situation in the world in which that everybody is thinking about, what are the ways ahead in terms of forms of sociality? What kind of society are we trying to imagine? What kind of relationships? What kind of access are we giving to us in order for us to become more human? So COVID creates a situation in which intellectuals are questioning the paradigms within which they have been operating, the way that we operate on the planet, the way that the economy, globalization, and all the forms of exploitation of humans and things and the environment, etc. So all of these things come to meet together and create a situation in which that all of us are questioning. And in the midst of these questionings, Professor Nyamnjoh bring a perspective on the problematic of resiliency. Most of the time we try to seek on the weak, on those who are being oppressed, resiliency among them. But we don't see the resiliency of the systems that prevent them from reestablishing themselves as human beings in the first place. So not to hold you for too long, I am going to introduce you, Professor Nyamnjoh. It's a pleasure to have you with us. And you are the inaugural conferencer for us in this session at MIDEQ. And I wish everybody a very, very enjoyable moment. Professor Nyamnjoh.
Good morning, Hans. I believe it is still very early out there in Miami.
It's too early.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for the kind words of introduction. They're heartwarming, and thanks a lot, Heaven, for asking me to present this first seminar, webinar in the series. I have decided to talk on the resilience of systemic suppression, oppression, and repression, because the COVID encounter that we all share has given us an opportunity to think deeply and think in a multifaceted way on some of the issues which we otherwise would not have had the time nor the calm composure to think about. In our case here in South Africa, we had an early lockdown in March, and it's been a lockdown in different layers. We are currently at level 1. And you can see for over 6 months or so, we have dutifully obeyed the lockdown with a few slippages here and there, but largely a very successful exercise at being locked down. And in the process, I wanted more like a form of therapy, more to stay sane, to reflect, have my own, keep a diary, as it were, of what I experienced and what I read up under COVID. And so this paper, which is very much a work in progress, is more like the biography of a pandemic. If you would, if you look at it, you would see a very detailed evidence of sources, mostly electronic material that have used as food for thought in this regard. One thing that strikes me with COVID is that immediately it surfaced in different parts of the world, the language of resilience came through, and it's a language that we experience each time there is a major force, whether natural disaster or man-made disasters. People are summoned to display an ability to withstand these otherwise overwhelming forces, to reach out in their repertoire of resilience and get the tools that would help them to deal with this. And often that is a commendable language and a commendable way to keep hope alive amongst the majority of people who suffer all sorts of vicissitudes. But often missing, if one reads this literature closely, is there's a sense of a missing dimension which one needs to bring to the fore in order to understand how successful the resilience of ordinary people would be, or why, despite such resilience, they often are measured to fall short. And it is the resilience of what Hans has already alluded to, of systemic structural forces in the lives of people. The very powerful forces, if we're not talking about natural forces, in this case, socially choreographed or socially crafted imbalances and inequalities in society that determines how power, privilege, and resources are distributed. Those forces always seem to withstand every other force, every resistance by people, or every challenge, every attempt at turning the tables on them. And I think that formidable resistance or resilience on the part of these forces requires closer attention, without necessarily minimizing the fact of the resilience of ordinary forces who often are the victims of. So I sought to bring these two into conversation, in that we cannot do justice to the abilities of ordinary folks to cope with this pandemic without at the same time taking a closer look at some of the structural forces that continue to pose as a hurdle to such a determined efforts by ordinary folks. I think the next slide, please. Yeah, one thing that I have learned that I decided to present this paper like as a research agenda of sorts, bringing out certain themes that strike me as worthy of further reflection. And one of the things that come to the fore is the very fact of COVID starting from a particular locality and within a very short time, rapidly compressing time and space in a way that is akin to the language that we have brought to bear on globalization as a process. So it has moved rapidly across the world. It has humbled borders and the battery of mechanisms that we have states and regions have perfected over the years to be able to detect, to be able to detain, and in some cases to be able to send back to where it's coming from in terms of various forms of mobility. But somehow with COVID, we have found that many nation states have not been able to police their borders in the same way. And I thought, this is very interesting. If those whom we have the habit of reaching out and containing were to develop the power to resist or to ignore our different attempts to police mobility, we would have a model of mobility that does not yield itself or lend itself to the idea of sovereignty that we normally associate with nation states or political communities. And then the question is, what could we learn from this resilient COVID vis-a-vis our regimes of control that could offer us a more creative or imaginative way of dealing with how we have traditionally attempted to police mobility? What if every other form of mobility had the power to impose itself that COVID does? How would we push our states to reimagine its technologies of control as we have today? And I think that is something for us to reflect a bit more about. Another thing has been that even as COVID has crossed borders effortlessly, somehow it has not been able to collapse the borders of the hierarchies of humanities that our particular political processes and the capitalist economy that has instituted. So at one level, it crosses physical borders because we are an interconnected world and we move very fast around. And it's been able to use that same network and reach out to various countries. But somehow, generally within every country, yes, it affects everybody, but it doesn't affect everybody in the same way. Somehow it has tended to fall prey to the resilient borders of hierarchies of humanities informed by race, informed by class, informed by gender, informed by education and many other things that you have. I'll give an example of various examples in this regard to buttress the point. Another point is that in many ways we have just suddenly looked for ways of surviving COVID. We have developed, reached out and seen amongst our coping mechanisms how to survive this otherwise humbling pandemic. And some of us have opted to go back home and employ technologies such as the one that I'm using to give this talk. And the technologies of being able to be absent from work, but present at the same time and effectively working remotely, and the technologies to be able to not to allow distance to stand in the way of productivity. That has worked for some of us, but if we look clearly, like the example of Pumla Dino Kola, who did an interesting piece here in South Africa, giving the example of domestic workers who have traditionally moved from the townships into the city centers and the suburbs to earn a living by giving their services to those who are better off in society. The idea of withdrawing from the office spaces to work from home hasn't worked for everybody, especially for domestic workers who have to leave home to work in someone else's home. And that is very understandable. I was joking this morning, giving the example, what if a domestic worker were to say, now that these new technologies as Zoom and are available, could I babysit for you by Zoom? Could I do your ironing and take care of your garden by Zoom? Could I say, sit behind, use my Zoom to instruct my employer how to trim their own garden and how to iron their own clothes and so on and so forth. So it's worked for some, but not for others. Again, it's a worthwhile research theme to dwell on for as we continue to seek to understand this pandemic. Next slide, please. Yeah. There's an area in which a lot of reflection has taken place under COVID. It's been the area of leadership. If you go online, you try to read any news source, you would come across the idea of leadership. Either its failings or have they done something that we could celebrate. Political leadership mostly. Some states like South Africa are held for having demonstrated leadership, like Ramaphosa, to impose a stringent lockdown, and some are faulted for not having taken timely measures to ensure that the population is safe, to ensure that the virus is contained, and so on. And there's always, this debate has tended to take the place of male leaders not quite rising to the occasion, and given the celebrating some female leaders like the leader of New Zealand, and who really came through as a model of how to act to contain the virus. So in a way, this has resurfaced debates that have always been there, but sometimes it has tended to be posed in stark dichotomies about, are men better leaders than women? Do men fail in leadership more than do women? Do we really need this? And in some cases, it is, although it's posed like that, one way of us trying to research it might be to ask the question, what does the fact of very successful female leaders teach us about leadership in general? Is it that women are better leaders, or simply that one needs a model of leadership that tries to privilege interconnections, there's more balance between amongst the various gender categories, that does not a priori privilege male as where you go to get inspiration for who should give a sense of direction. So basically the debates have been up there, and one might want to continue with them and see how gender intersects with leadership and how we can draw on it to inform our research. Okay, the next point, please. I put my good friend Donald Trump here because somehow he has epitomized this particular debate around the failure of leadership, the politicization of a pandemic, especially when it coincides with an impending election, and often it's been pandemics. One thing that comes across is that a pandemic such as COVID does not have patience with local politics or attempts at politicization and so on. So in a way, Trump appears here to epitomize the worst of leadership possible. The very debate around wearing masks and what it means to your image, maybe as a strong man, as a macho person, and so on and so forth. And you know, the casualties have been telling, and perhaps one way of proceeding, one lesson we could learn from this is how to provide for leadership that is productive in a context where it's all too easy for people to politicize events or phenomena or challenges such as COVID. Another thing that I think is worth learning from here, and perhaps instructing ourselves, informing ourselves how to develop or to reinvent leadership in areas of a global pandemic, is the idea that we have very easily resorted to very narrow national boundaries or state boundaries as they currently exist. Although COVID has positioned itself and proven repeatedly that it's a global problem, we have tended to think that we could solve it through national policies and national action plans. And this has actually turned out to be rather myopic. And the challenge then remains, how do we develop global leadership for a truly global problem that defies the national and regional logics, such as COVID. The next slide, please. Yeah, and I think I've hinted at this before, but it's abundantly clear now that COVID has somehow acted in connivance with systemic inequalities and hierarchies. In every society that you look at, the inequalities made possible or exacerbated by our neoliberal economic structures have somehow have warmed up, or do I say have found a common bedfellow in COVID. COVID has somehow reached out and has been extended a hand of friendship by these inequalities in society and with devastating results. Whether you look at it in terms of race or class or ethnicities or gender and sexuality, all those who normally have a raw deal, traditionally speaking, in society, have just found their predicament compounded by under COVID. Now, of course, when COVID, I was amused when I read attempts to understand or to explain how COVID would fare in Africa. At first, it was clearly a doom and gloom scenario. Everybody who remotely thought of Africa in relation to COVID reached the conclusion that the continent would suffer the most from it because first, it's poor infrastructure, it's all sorts of negative attributes are associated with Africa. And then suddenly people became perplexed. They couldn't understand why the COVID figures on the continent are relatively lower than anywhere else, and so on. And the more I thought about it, the more it struck me that as a continent that has had a raw deal over the years, for centuries, maybe this was the one time where a disease or a pandemic that thrives on mobility would not find Africa an attractive space. Because for one thing, the continent does not have the elaborate infrastructure to facilitate mobility. The road networks are poor. Of course, you remember when COVID started, immediately the border, the airports and various entry points were closed down. So if there was to be any spread of COVID within Africa, it would have to be by road, it would have to be by train, it would have to be by these different means of transportation. And in many regards, those infrastructures are poor, which basically means that it takes a lot longer for somebody with COVID in Africa to do the rounds and infect all others than it would say do in Europe, where even when the external borders are closed, people still have the very good infrastructure to move around and interact with others. Despite Africa's investment in sociality, the fact of infrastructure not being very developed could have been a mitigating factor in terms of the spread of COVID. The next slide, please. Yeah, one thing that came across, I think, was the debate around the idea of resilient colonial sorry, I missed the slide. There was a slide before this on. Okay, good. Yeah, I've done that. The next one, please. Good. This example here about okay. Yeah, there's been a challenge. The challenge has been, of course, the fact that with something that is something like COVID, where people immediately associate remedies with modern day science and with well-resourced economies and well-resourced parts of the world, it has enacted a debate on the continent about Africa's relevance and Africa's capacity to provide solutions as well. And so and this debate has tended to take a colonial or neo-colonial undertone. And the fact that one area where it played out was with the herbal remedies that countries in Africa started proposing, and at the forefront of which was Madagascar as a possible cure. And immediately the president of Madagascar was challenged by people who thought that this is not scientific. So while science is clearly the way to go for looking for solutions, and one must not underplay that, it is difficult for science to do it while excluding other voices and other, especially in terms of popular ways of understanding illness and relating to challenges such as the pandemic. So a more productive way for science to be truly relevant and helpful and to be such that whatever its findings are, it's embraced as widely as possible, would be for science to have the humility of knowing that it lives in a world where there are multiple understandings of what is going on. So humility to enter conversations with other ways of seeing and doing. And that those conversations do not have to be overbearing, do not have to be exclusionary, do not have to overly dramatize zero-sum pretensions to how we go about addressing the COVID challenge. And in an African context, that was a very good debate that surfaced. Science, of course, as we know from current reportings on vaccines, possible vaccines, it is not something that you attain just with the press of a button. It takes time, it takes lots of trials and errors, and eventually lots of laboratory experiments, and eventually you come by a solution, which is often, you could describe science as perhaps 95% failure, 5% success. And if it is 95% failure, then it should have the scientists should have the humility of listening to others who may come up with suggestions that herbal cures could, solutions could help out, and not dismiss them a priori, but enter a productive conversation with them. And I think in this regard, Africa's experience is a useful inspiration. Thanks. The next one, please. Yeah, often earlier I referred to our attempt to react to COVID-19 in a rather conventional way by falling back on national or state level leadership when sometimes a global solution is what we should be seeking. And there's a good example of exactly this in relation to COVID in Italy that we could draw on. And this was reported sometimes, I think around May or so, where when Italy was down and completely captured by or almost suffocated by COVID, it turned to its neighbors for PPE, for protective gear, to help out. And Italy is part of the EU, so naturally it would turn to EU for assistance. And Italy is part of Europe, so naturally it turns to Europe. But European countries that it turned to were busy preserving whatever material it had for its own nationals, for its own immediate citizens, despite the idea of an EU community. And it took South Africa to send 800,000 masks to Italy when the rest of Europe would not provide a solution. Now, this might be, you could easily dismiss this as insignificant, but it is telling about how we could begin to build, bring together the building blocks for a new model of collaboration in a truly global and interconnected world, in a truly globalized and interconnected world. I thought this was quite significant and worth reporting on. Next slide, please. Yeah, we've learned that with COVID again, seeking nationwide solutions to a global pandemic and seeking to contain it, we have closed down borders nationally and provincially. We have instituted various measures of social distancing and policies to be able to work from home. It's clear that the implications of working from home have been, in some instances, that given the patriarchal order in which we often find ourselves, women have suffered more, the tensions of living in the same house or same room in some cases with somebody whom you have tense relations with have only resulted in violence and violations of various kinds. Migrants in various places, when it started, first, everyone from China and Eastern Europe found themselves the victims of prejudice and stereotypes in various parts of the West and in North America. And quite paradoxically, Africans in China faced discrimination, that they were likely to be those who would spread the virus and so on. So these challenges that one faces when one is immobilized or when one moves into zones where one is not normally expected to be, are the very heart of the sort of work that we do at MIDEQ. And I think we may want to draw extensively from the COVID experience to enrich how we tackle these issues, and especially what it tells us about the interconnections and just the idea of how are we to relate to the stranger, especially a weak stranger, now that a very powerful stranger like COVID has proven to us that strangers, when they are well armed, can violate you with impunity. So does that teach us about the humility to be able to see ourselves in the stranger and the stranger in us, now that a very wicked prisoner taking stranger in the form of COVID has proven to us the limits of the stranger as a catalog of violations. Next point, please. Yes, to conclude is just basically to see that COVID has affected the world seriously, our livelihoods, in ways that we couldn't have imagined before January this year. It has led to all sorts of devastations, economies have plummeted and the like. But is there a way in which we can draw the right lessons from this to see how to deal with the resilient systemic inequalities that COVID has exposed even further, and then there's the element of leadership, and there's the element of when do we put politics, especially the sort of politician politics aside, and form new solidarities to bring about action that is creative, innovative, not only for COVID, maybe in a post-COVID world as a way of preparing for future challenges. And basically a recognition that the world cannot continue to appeal to victims of inequalities that are structural, injustices that are embedded in the very way that our societies are built to bend over backwards to prove themselves. When we take attention away from those highly ingrained structural inequalities. And very finally, the last one, please. Food for thought. To what extent in our post-COVID world will we, in positions of power and privilege, have learned to exercise greater accommodation of those we tend to dehumanize, and either to immobilize or to mobilize purely on our own terms? So that's the question that I will leave you with. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Francis, for a really thoughtful paper and discussion, very provocative, and a lot of discussions. And before we open the discussions to everybody else, I think that let's have a conversations on all those thought-provoking ideas that you brought to the table. I have several points here I would like us to elaborate further. It's not just for you, for everybody who who is part of this assistance here. We know, of course, that the COVID situation has deconstructed in certain way our social imaginaries about the reality of life, the social orders of things, the orders of things, the natural orders of things. And so there are a lot we cannot yet generate a kind of comprehensive, articulated discourse or that could explain those, factors, those deconstructions. However, we can try to, to see what elements that provide certain types of coherence to the discussions and to the problematic that it raises. So one of the key points that you brought was the whole idea of resiliency, right? I mean, the kind of perverse way to think, to govern people. At one point, we talk about those who have the ability to suffer, the ability to, to go through the suffering or to go through the marginalization, but still exist, are still there, to continue to make sacrifices because, disasters are upon us, we have to respond. And at the same time, we don't pay attention as society to the structural form that generate the vulnerability of those who are being victim at the first place, right? It's a very interesting paradox. It brings us to the question of, what kind of, reflexivity that we can bring to the concept of resiliency. Before you answer that, let me just take a background here. I have been studying disaster for a long time in my life. And one thing that we know, and one thing that the literature on disasters has always said, disasters comes, disaster never go. When they hit, the first thing they do, the disasters, man-made, human-made, you name it, complex emergencies, they hit the most vulnerable, they weaken them, the most vulnerable of societies. They unveil and weaken. But at the same time, paradoxically, it reinforces the structures, the mega structures, whether at the level of the states, whether at the level of corporations. It does a transfer of knowledge, a transfer of power, a transfer of resources. For example, in the United States, globally, we would say, Jeff Bezos and Amazon.com, have obtained trillions. In the States and in Europe, in many countries, you have had bailouts, that benefited, big corporations. There is a transfer of money, there is a transfer of power, there is a transfer of every single thing that was supposed to be available to the most of the population to create the possibility for the police, for the city, for the life in the city, the community to be possible. And those resources are being transferred in a situation in which that is constrained, by precisely what the disaster called for. Right? So you have a kind of inversion that happens when disasters hit. They hit, they weaken the already weakens, and they are less prepared for the next disaster, regardless the form is going to take, and we ask them to continue to manifest their civility as humans, their capacity to be creative as humans. And yet those forces that are oppressing them are reinforced, and it, times folded. And then after that, the next disaster will hit. And I took one example that came to mind was Banda, Aceh, and Haiti. And I take the case to Haiti to go quick. The disaster hit, the most vulnerable have been destroyed. There was more than $10 billion that was dropped to Haiti. Haiti never benefited 1 billion out of the 10 billion. And those who benefited out of a part of the 10 billion, the 1 billion that went to Haiti, it went to the upper level of those precisely who they bailed them out, and the majority remained the same situation. And then later on, 2 years or 3 years later, 4 years later, actually, we got a Matthew, which is a hurricane, another form of disaster. And all those people who were displaced to live in the, in areas that have been totally shaken and destabilized. And these people, of course, have been the most attacked, the most to suffer, and so forth and so on. And as a result, again, you have this time not billions, but hundreds of millions of dollars, pool. But again, that follows exactly the same thing. So the question is that what to think about resiliency conceptually to make it a tool that can help rethink about the new post-COVID situations to emerge, and that allow us to, imagine the disaster of the future. How will it happen, and how will it help us? How will this concept help us to identify, lines of what kind of resiliency are we talking about here?
I think you're spot on, and the example you gave is a very good one. I would say that we should reimagine our idea, or we should rethink our idea of disaster. In this case, disaster as a natural force, disaster as in the form of COVID and so on, and perhaps begin to think of the societies that are heavily unequal, built around inequality, as a disaster that needs to be attacked, that we have to develop a certain resilience against. We don't think enough of unequal economic situations as a disaster, an emergency that requires people to stand up and fight. As I was reading up for this paper, I came across reports that although everyone has suffered economically under COVID, and although even the big 5 tech companies have suffered, relatively speaking, they have laughed all the way to the bank, because they've actually made far more under COVID in terms of profit than anyone else, or even if it fell slightly lower than the expected profit margins. Now, if you were to ask people to rally against such obvious disaster as a natural pandemic as COVID, a creative way of thinking about it would also be to fight inequality as a disaster, as something that requires our resilience, those who are victims of it, to mobilize our forces and fight it. And that's the point I think I try to make in this paper by deliberately turning the tables on certain predictable ideas of traditional conventional understandings of resilience, to say, okay, what about these forces? As you say, a disaster strikes you, but it never retires. Inequality strikes you, but it never retires. It doesn't leave easily. And I think if you listen very keenly, the sort of discourses and pronouncements that have been made since COVID, since COVID became part of our daily reality, people like the Secretary General of the UN has actually referred to inequality as another pandemic equivalent to COVID. So again, people notice that, they speak out, but the question becomes, how do we translate such speeches into action in a way that actually has an impact? But
so,
yeah.
Which takes us to the whole question of leadership, of course, and I think it was very interesting that you discuss this point, the leadership around the world, and to show differences in leadership between genders and in different countries, nation state. but I am also interested, and I wonder how you see when COVID hit societies, they don't just hit states, institutions, or big apparatus, they hit communities, and communities in the absence of the states respond. And for example, in the United States, you know, the the pandemic of COVID pandemic was, of course, received with the, you know, with the pandemic of racism and racial inequality and all those inequalities we are talking about. So then those the intersections. So the responses from those to whom a lot have been asked for, you know, to adapt, to obey, to have the bodies, but the docile bodies, you know, be adapted. So then the state, we can go through this together. We are in all of it together. The leadership that comes from below challenge the leadership from above in many ways. And I know that it's part of your, you know, of your thinking, but it didn't come, you know, more visible. If you can talk a little more about this type of leadership that comes not just in the countries in the North, in many countries in Africa, in many countries in the America, in the communities react, they responded to protect themselves when a supra institution cannot protect them, or when traditionally the state or other super institution never protected them. Whether they use, you know, other kind of alternative forms to react and to respond, they respond. And I think one area that will require a lot of reflections and investigations is not just what the dominant narratives are saying about, you know, the global forces that are shaping the world, but there are alternative forces that are also in the world and shaping the world from different standpoints and from different perspectives, which requires our attention.
In fact, you have placed your finger on it. It is such efforts are widespread, such solidarities can be found in every country. I wouldn't list all of them here in South Africa, which is why I said from the outset that if I had set out to write a paper about conventional understandings of resilience, I would have had a paper all about how ordinary South Africans or Cameroonians or Nigerians or Ghanaians were able to rally forces, or in Kenya, the example I gave of the mother who was cooking stones for her children because she didn't have food. The idea being that the children might fall asleep while waiting for a meal that was not really going to be delivered. Lots of Kenyans rallied around and tried to help that lady out, and she was all very thankful for it. And they also set up funds to help others in similar situations. So those forces are clear, they are there. But my argument is that, in fact, those are the very same actions that divert attention from the real problems of any given society. It's not to minimize them, but it's to say that in order to make people rise beyond that level of beggarliness of just seeking to make ends meet, it is important to target the structural forces in societies that produce such human, that makes nonsense of otherwise very productive humans in any given context.
So we are going to open the discussion and we come back again. I have some questions. We don't want to monopolize the discussion here. And I'm sure that Heaven has been able to gather some notes for us. So let's listen to the first question.
Thank you both. Yes, we have 3 questions at the moment. I'm wondering whether in the interest of time, I might give them all to you, because there may be some connections between them that you want to pull out, and at least then the questions are on the table, although everybody can also pick them up in the chat. So the first question is from Stephanie Nowen, who is really talking about this issue of leadership that you were just touching upon, and how that's potentially very challenging in places with unstable government leadership. So Stephanie's curious about what Francis thinks about more localized efforts of leadership. For example, the indigenous communities in the US and what they've done to protect themselves. So in the absence of kind of good quality senior leadership, have there been efforts that you're aware of that are more localized and have been more effective? Question from Dereji Fayesa follows on from that, and it's really on female leadership specifically. So what is the evidence for this, except for some anecdotes? So is it just anecdotal evidence, or 1 or 2 individuals that have been particularly successful, if you like? Or is there something particular about what Dereji is saying, feminine leadership qualities? And I think you alluded to those, Francis, when you talked about a willingness to sort of promote interconnectedness. Is that are you suggesting, I think I'm just building on Dereji's question, are you suggesting this is an inherently feminine characteristic that only female leaders can have, or is there something else going on? Dereji also was wondering, and I think this is a slightly different question, is around this notion of herd immunity in the context of Africa. So I think a little bit more perhaps about why you think that the spread of COVID has not been so rapid or dramatic in the context of Africa, because you presented one theory around the infrastructure, but I know there are multiple other theories, for example, in relation to demographics, age, and I think the question from Dereji, I'm slightly taking the questions in my own direction, I'm sorry, but it's about the extent to which notions of the virus in Africa have been kind of created a sense of false security, in a sense, which might add to the continent's vulnerability. And the final question, just throw it in the mix, and then you can decide which ones you decide to answer, is from Carl Landstrom, who says, thank you very much for the excellent talk, Professor Nyamnjoh. Enjoyed the point about humility, and maybe particularly a type of epistemic humility. What role, if any, do you think epistemic humility could play in challenging how, for example, academics or policymakers engage with non-Western epistemologies? So that's quite a different question, but maybe is something that overarches your paper in terms of trying to have a different take on some of these issues. I suggest that the limitations of time, you take them in whichever order you like, and whichever ones you feel that you've got more to say, and if we have time for another round or to extend, then we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Heaven. I think these are very good questions. When Hans said his few remarks on me, he mentioned something about incompleteness. And I think this is the time for me to draw on that idea of incompleteness to inform my answer to all 4 questions here. And basically in that, the idea of incompleteness is a recognition that we, whether by nature or culturally or socially, in many ways incomplete, and that is what drives us. That's what drives us to seek opportunities to enhance ourselves through relating with one another in various ways and so on. But often there are 2 approaches to seeking to undo for seeking to address incompleteness. Some approach it with the understanding, however delusory, that it is possible for one to become complete. It's possible for one to transcend incompleteness into what you might call completeness in zero-sum fashion. That often leads to all sorts of violence and violation because it's a foolhardy illusion. Another model which seems to speak to lots of these issues is that Incompleteness is not something negative, it's something just to be aware of and to cultivate a disposition that helps you to maximize your chances when relating to others. In other words, you know yourself very well, you know your strengths, and then you know your weaknesses, and you reach out to others to complement you to the extent possible in order to achieve, to enhance yourself in whatever way possible, not in a total zero-sum fashion, but in a way that enables you to recognize your debts to others and so on. And it comes with a certain humility, a certain recognition that you are possible only through interconnections, and those interconnections should make you feel comfortable with an arrangement that foregrounds interdependence rather than this illusion of independence. And therefore, I would use that as to speak in terms of epistemic humility, to suggest an epistemology of incompleteness that necessarily opens up to what I have tended to call conviviality. And that speaks to issues of leadership, in the sense that when a national level leadership is failing us, it doesn't have to be the end of the road for us. We fall back on other instances, intermediary and local level leaderships. So leadership works best always in complement through those interconnections. Leadership works best when it is imbued with a humility of incompleteness. Whether we're speaking male leaders or female leaders, national level leaders or indigenous level, local level leaders, the element to bring on board in order to maximize our achievements is recognizing and providing for incompleteness and the conviviality that comes with that. And so I think it answers every question. Thank you.
Okay, Heaven, do you have any questions? If I can ask one, if there is none.
No, there's no further questions that have come through. So if you want to either answer some of the ones that have already come through or ask Francis another one, you're very welcome.
Okay, there is somebody.
Just one has just come through even as we're talking.
Yes. Yes, go ahead.
From Sahira, when talking about global leadership, I wonder what Francis thinks about the role of international organizations, for example, WHO, in this pandemic, and issues of global inequality. Are you optimistic about their roles in the future? Maybe take that one, Francis, and then Hans, if you have one of your own or want to build on some of the questions that have been asked.
Yes, I think WHO has operated within the conventional setting, and where nation states and are still considered the first point of call, even when we are dealing with a truly global pandemic. And you see, it is within that framework that it has somehow been experienced some challenges when some nation states decide to withhold their contributions or to withdraw completely. Now, despite that, it has done quite well. But we could draw to ask the question, if WHO could already begin to provide some interesting or useful or important leadership in this area, wouldn't we be in an even better position in a new model of leadership where emphasis is on global action and global solidarities? So it was formed in a context where more like an exception to have an international organization. Now, if we push ourselves to rethink and provide for institutions within the canopy of a globalized world, an interconnected world, that is where the emphasis lies. Would we not be able to achieve even more with organizations like WHO? I think that would be my sense.
And if not too much on a question for you, Francis, but kind of extension of the reflections that you have triggered here, and all the colleagues have participated in, and ideas such as again taking back the idea of leadership, the need for most of us, I'm sure those who are participating in this webinar are social scientists in one way or another, reflecting on, how you create spaces for civic actions, for communities to take themselves in charge, in order for them to be more proactive in the absence of the ability of the states, in general, to provide. We see leadership, of course, through social movements. And we were saying and talk about that. A lot of, very unique movements, are taking shape. And I think it was one of those who asked question, I think it was Stephanie, who talked about the whole idea of indigenous community in the United States, who have to take things at hand to organize itself in a certain way to live. So beyond the communities of interest, the communities of groups of common ethnicities who have been chronically marginalized, who seek to see, how they can carve a path, in order for them to become less vulnerable, in order for them also to imagine society, to generate a new social imaginary of society to take form. So you have those forms that are emerging, and I think that we need to pay attention to these forms and to help us advance in these reflections about, after the manifestation of the disaster, what remains with the disaster, what do we do with it, And there are also leadership along generation, and which is a category that we don't talk too much in general when we discuss these, global issues and communal issues. New generations of that are organized around, technological platforms, new young people who are in gangs, in communities, marginalized in favelas, if we are talking about countries like Brazil, in slums all over the world, and in the townships, like if we talk about South Africa. Those young generations are coming with dreams, but with no models, no heroes, except the heroes of capitalism, which take us to think about, other kind of intersections that are extremely strange, that for us require thinking. For example, the Trump that you brought, the Trump situation in the United States, but also we can say the same thing for, Bolsonaro in Brazil. Of course, there is that aspect about, retreatism, about manhood, masculinity, and exclusion. But also there is that aspect of 73 million people voted for Trump. And those 73 million people are not necessarily 73 million, big companies. Those are people living in communities, retreating with the concept of race because they are excluded from globalization, global processes. Young people that I found, and Black people, and I'm very surprised to see that, and Latino people who are being humiliated, and at the same time, see that they are seeking some voices. So new forms of leadership are emerging, but ideas that will help channel these leaderships to a kind of more collective and meaningful action that benefits this group, are still being searched. They are still in search of these things. And leaders emerge, not out of a vacuum. They emerge out of, our anxiety, our crisis, and they give us so many case figures. I cannot wrap my head, for example, in Brazil, to see how popular the Bolsonaro is and how popular he is in subjugating his own people, and those being subjugated invested in exactly the instruments that are subjugating them at the same time. Now, of course, in general, we come with the idea of alienation, but those are two easy concepts.
Yes.
Those are required a certain kind of thinking about how people are trying to strive in order for them to make their community possible. So those line of thinking, I think that, of course, because of time, we are extremely limited. But I think that you open the gate for a lot of thematics, a lot of reflections, because the post-COVID situation is today. Well, we are in the middle of COVID. We are not in the post yet. So we are to think of it, humbly, but also to see so many different connections that we may have missed. And I think that we give you the last word, and after that, we leave it to heaven.
And very quickly, just to say, I won't elaborate on it, but I think you started off by mentioning storytelling, that sometimes I indulge in storytelling. And maybe one of those stories is pertinent here, but I won't elaborate. It's a story from the late Nigerian writer called Amos Tutuola. And in his story, he talks about somebody called the complete gentleman. And the complete gentleman starts his life as a skull and is challenged by an event to borrow body parts from different parts of the world or different human beings to enhance himself until he's the complete gentleman. Now his completeness is not unified, singular, or linear. It is a composite completeness. Now maybe we should introduce this compositeness into more and more people that we encounter, or more and more situations, because compositeness would explain a lot. It will explain why it is possible for somebody to love and hate Trump at the same time. He is a composite being. At one level, he is this, and then it appeals to the evangelicals. At another level, he is this. He tells you as he thinks it, as he sees it. And another is this. But for most, he is the devil incarnate. Okay, the same for Bolsonaro. So the idea of compositeness of being is very useful in that if we are incomplete beings normally, how we come to be is through taking others in and making part of who we are, a composite being. And that compositeness would mean that you cannot be linear and monolithic in trying to fathom who we are. You have to provide for the complexities and the nuances in order to get a good picture of who we are in our compositeness of being. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you, Hans. It feels like a very pertinent sort of intro to the conclusion, if that makes sense. In that, I think what your presentation and also the conversation showed was the complexity of COVID, the sort of ways in which it's deepened and amplified existing inequalities, but how those things are not necessarily linear or straightforward. And I think very much the purpose of MIDEQ and part of our work so far has really been trying to pull out those very complex and sometimes unexpected and unpredictable and unpredicted consequences of COVID, because inequalities are also intersectional. And we see all the time the intersection of different inequalities in ways which, as you say, Hans, means that some people's allegiances seem to be misplaced because they're not necessarily things that can support or help them to become less marginalized, and yet they appeal for different reasons in terms of people's interests. So I'd really like to thank you both for the contributions, and particularly you, of course, Francis, for your paper and your thought-provoking presentation. If I may, I'll also thank the people who joined us for this webinar and thank them for their contributions, particularly in terms of the questions, and hopefully they'll be interested in picking up on our work subsequently. My colleague Elise Colley has organised this event, and we're very grateful to her support, and the tech worked, which was fabulous, mostly, PowerPoint slides notwithstanding. Our next event is on the 13th of January 2021, at the same time GMT, and that will be with Professor Paul Cook from the University of Leeds, who is another of our MIDEQ advisory board members. And along with members of his team, he'll be speaking about the Changing the Story project, which explores the ways in which civil society organizations for young and other vulnerable people function in 5 post-conflict settings, in Colombia, in Cambodia, Rwanda, Kosovo, and South Africa. And I think, like the work of Francis, Paul's work is not necessarily focused specifically or exclusively on migration, but that's precisely its value, that it embeds migration processes and outcomes in these broader inequalities, and also in these issues about how we change the narratives, how we construct different narratives that position people within these narratives in a different way. So I hope you'll join us for that event, and we'll certainly circulate details of that in due course. Now, when we all arrived at this event, we had some music playing from our friend and colleague, Gamli Torsro from the University of Glasgow, Ghanaian in origin, and I understand that some of the music also from the Ghanaian context, of course. And that music is now also going to play us out. But while we do that, it would be really nice to see who's been with us on this particular call. So if you all want to put your videos on, if you can, say hello, have a wave out for Francis and Hearn. So we do this sort of, symbolic clapping. And just always nice to see who people are in person rather than just having people's names on a screen. So as I say, thank you all very much for your contributions, particularly thanks to Francis and to Hearns. And we hopefully will see you at the next event.